Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to another segment of this conversation on quantitative methods. In this specific one, I'd like to share some ideas and some impressions and contributions on how can we think of strategies to bring quantitative and qualitative methods together. Um, there's a lot of talk recently and a lot of encouragement to bring quantitative and qualitative methods together to enhance our capacities to generate quality knowledge. But I still believe there could be one or two ideas that I might share with you that may contribute to this quanti-quality dynamics. Just a second, so I will start sharing my slides. Okay. Well, specialization in different research methods is not a surprise. There are many reasons why individuals may opt to specialize in quantity or quality or textual or theoretical analysis and so on. And this is, again, this is not unusual. We also have different preferences, for instance, in other realms of life, such as our professional lives. Some individuals have different preferences or interests, and these may lead them to pursue different careers, right? And when it comes to research methods and learning different research methods, there's also an array of explanations why we may end up deciding to specialize in one method vis-a-vis the others. And I will just bring a couple of examples here, and certainly there are more, but I think this may illustrate these different dynamics leading to why one ends up specializing quantity or quality methods, right? I think the first one is sheer preference. Certain individuals may just enjoy certain activities more, or may prefer to deal with different types of information, or interested in different types of knowledge production. But there's other issues as well, as for instance, the very opportunity to learn quantitative or qualitative methods. And this may depend on, for instance, the degree we pursued, or the department one offering courses, the degree and the university one is attending, and so on, right? Some departments are better equipped to teach qualitative methods, others are better equipped to teach quantitative methods. So this itself restricts what may be available to us as students. There are also some job market pressures in different contexts. Some skills may be more valuable in the job market. And for these reasons, certain individuals may invest more on those skills, aiming to be more successful and more employable in the job market, right? And ideally, in research context, we would expect individuals from different traditions to or trained in different methods to in constant dialogues and exchange. So this would lead to a virtual cycle of knowledge production, right? One method would inform the other, would help to cover the blind spots of the other. And there are multiple ways in which we can bring multiple methods, traditions together. And here I'm mentioning only two of them. One, probably the most usual example, is a research project that collects and analyzes quantitative and qualitative data, right? It may have some focus groups and some surveys, or use administrative data and interviews, and so on, right? And a second type, or a second way to conceive this quality and quantity interaction in knowledge production is at the disciplinary level, right? We may have different research projects, one, say, focusing more on quantitative data, the other focusing more on qualitative data, and results from one project may inform activities in the other, again in this mutual influence manner, right? Um, and when we talk about quantitative, qualitative contributions and bringing them together, I think quantitative methods have a lot to bring to the table. What I'm presenting you here is the way I tend to see or to conceive the mutual engagement of different methods and the mutual influences of results from one tradition onto the other. It should be said that this is by no way the only or a consensual view. Other colleagues may disagree, you may disagree, you may have different ways to think of the mutual contributions of different methods traditions, but this is how I usually see them, and I think this may be an interesting way at least to start a conversation on the matter, right? This is a cycle. Of course, there is no clear starting point here, but I tend to perceive these steps following in the happening in the following order, right? For instance, qualitative studies with small n, small cases may, for instance, use interviews and focus groups to develop a very detailed account of a relevant issue. But because of the very nature of qualitative studies and small n studies in general, they do not necessarily produce findings that may be expandable or generalizable to the population of interest. So results from a qualitative study in step one may eventually brings us to the question of how prevalent are those findings in the population. And then we go to a more quantitative step, right? Quantitative research methods are very well suited to collect and analyze large amounts of data and process them in order to find broader trends or to provide us with a snapshot of a moment, right? So starting from a small n research that highlighted important issues to be understood, we go to a second step to see how widespread and how common is that in a population of interest. The study of this broad large N study can eventually flag cases that are apart from the trend. And this may lead us to another follow-up question, which is, what about these cases that fall far apart from the overall trend? Well, these cases make very interesting sites and cases for in-depth case studies, so we can better understand what makes those cases so peculiar and so different from the trend. These qualitative case studies may raise other bunch of questions. For instance, okay, we understand what makes this, why these cases are different and possibly what make them different from the trend, but what would be the explanations for their specificities, right? And then we have again a great spot for quantitative and even experimental research, in which we would design studies where we can change some factors and see how changing certain factors may influence in the results or in the outcomes, right? These are difficult studies to conduct. There are many ethical issues to be deal with here, but it's a potential way to go further to the compared to the case studies. Okay, what can we what can happen if we change some variables or some factors or some details in one case? Would this trigger change in this project? For instance, if we manipulate or if we have similar settings and one receives one condition or more funding, for instance, and the other receives not funding or a different type of resource, would results be the same in or not, right? So it helps us to disentangle what could be explaining differences here and what change those manipulations would conduct. And out of this quantitative or experimental research, there are certainly more questions to be raised. Would these findings raise new questions to be studied in detail using qualitative studies? Do they help us to understand what causes what, or what explains what at least? So one step leads us to the next in a very productive way. Even though not many researchers employ or take all these steps, this is clearly, in my opinion, a very productive way of dealing with it. And I will use a quick, simple example here to illustrate this virtual cycle of research collaborations. So let's start with this simple example. Let's say that researchers conducted focus groups and interviews with head teachers, and they found that insufficient school funding leads to higher dropout rates, which is not surprising. But let's, just for the sake of example, take this as a novel finding, right? So after reading results from this qualitative research that studied a few schools, one could ask, is this claim valid for the entire school system, or this is happening only in very specific schools, right? Of course, common sense would probably endorse the former explanation, but for the sake of this example, so far we don't know how widespread the issue is. And qualitative studies may not be the best options to examine whether or not this problem is widespread or this finding is widespread. And here there is a lot of room for contributions from quantitative studies, right? Because then we can eventually collect data for hundreds, even thousands of schools, calculate what is the average level of funding received per student per school every year. We can also collect data for these different schools. What is the dropout or the retention rate for each school, and so on. For instance, we can get this information just examining official documents, and then we can take this official data and we create a data set to examine the connection between these two issues, right? And when we get these two pieces of information and put them together, we can analyze this data in multiple ways. And here, one of the things I did was to create a visual representation of the relationship between these two variables, right? The horizontal axis here means the average funding per student received by schools. In the vertical axis, we have the retention rate for each school, and each dot in this plot is one of the schools, right? For instance, this school here receiving about £2,000 per year per student has a retention rate of about 35% only, which is quite low, which means, inverting the argument, that this school may have a dropout rate higher than 60%, right? So we can analyze this data and do other procedures with the data. And we find, for instance, that this pattern linking funding to retention indicates that the lesser funding per student in a school, the lower the retention rate. In other words, the higher the retention rate, as we can see by this brown orange line here, right? We see that schools at the lower end of funding have lower retention rates, and the more funding schools receive, the higher are the retention rates. But we also find another interesting thing here. At this part of the data, we find a very steepy relationship between funding and retention rate. But after about 6,000 pounds per year per student, we see that the effect is not as pronounced as for the other part of this, the other group of schools, right? So this itself show us important findings and may suggest some interesting policy recommendations, right? Maybe after a certain level, at least when you're talking about retention only, right? After a certain level of funding, there's no visible improvement in terms of retention rate. Of course, more funding may result in better classroom structures, better paid teachers, better libraries, etc. But here we are looking only at the retention, and for retention only, we see that at some point there are reduced returns per investment. Okay, and there are some policy implications to be eventually drawn from here, and I will let you to think some of them. Right. That said, there's something in that is a bit unusual in this graph, and that may be potentially of potential interest for further studies. Can you find what is different or unusual here? When you look at this distribution of schools, we find that these two schools, they they are apart from the trend, right? We see a school here with a relatively low funding per student, doing very well in terms of retention rates, and this other school here that's more well off, but not doing well in terms of retention. This school here has a very high dropout rate, right? And these two studies, just these two cases, are that we detected doing this quantitative analysis, they make great sites and make great opportunities, great places for case studies. So here we see how we can move from, say, the step 3 in that cycle of large N study to a small N study, in this case, the analysis of specific cases in in-depth case studies. So it is a relatively common place nowadays to exhort multi-methods research as a form to enrich our knowledge production, but there's probably more talk than walk here, even among well-intended colleagues. And the question that we have to answer is, why is that the case? Why, despite of all the potential benefits of multi-method studies, we're still lagging behind in terms of implementing them? Well, one of them is that despite of the benefits that come of some level of specialization, because then we have specialists doing quality study in the different traditions, unfortunately, there is also some extreme or ultra over specialization, which sometimes lead to this siloization and compartmentalization of knowledge that's detrimental, right? And why this happens? Well, there are many reasons for that. One of them may be simply lack of training in different research methods and research traditions, either because there was no opportunity for those individuals to learn at least a little bit of the different methods. They may not received proper encouragement to develop this broader toolkit in terms of methods, and were incentivized to over specialize in specific skills. And this lack of mutual understanding leads to mutual suspicion, which undermines the potential for mixed methods results, studies that makes the most of them and bring us more interesting results, right? What can you do about it? Well, there's no magic solution, and the encouragement of mixed method research should be should be accompanied by multiple measures. For instance, one of them is multiple exposure to different methods. Quantitative researchers be more exposed to qualitative literature, qualitative researchers reading more, consuming more quantitative literature, so they understand better what is the contribution made by each one. A second suggestion, which is difficult in terms of training and resource available, but is important nevertheless, is continuous training. Not only the exposure to different methods tradition, but keep learning different tools that can be informative of what can be achieved, at least using some of them, at least informative about using them. So because then they will understand better the limitations and capabilities of different methods. And a final step that I will mention here, which I find especially interesting and important, but also a bit difficult to carry on, is the constant reflection and revising and challenging our previous perceptions on what can be achieved by different methods. Right? We have to challenge our own prejudices against different methods tradition if we want to really engage with mixed methods studies. And in the next slide, I will give you a very interesting example of how we have to challenge our previous perceptions, because we are so used to do things the way we have been always doing, right? So, well, in this picture, you have two different types of shovels, right? On your left side, you have a shovel, an English shovel used to dig trenches in World War One. And on your right side, you have a French shovel also used to dig trenches in World War One. They're both shovels, but you see they have different shapes. Their blades have different shapes, and their handles are also very different. So the way you hold and use the shovels are very different. Even though this may sound a bit, well, too easy, you just have to take another shovel and adjust your hand, and then you can handle the shovel properly and do what you have to do. This is not as simple as it sounds. I bring you now a quote from a very interesting essay by the French ethnologist Marcel Mauss, from an essay titled The Techniques of Body. Marcel Mauss was involved in the war effort in France in an administrative role. And in this essay, he wrote the following. Well, there's some text behind this, and then he comes with this quote. But this specificity is characteristics of all techniques. He's talking about being specializing bodies in different cultures to do things differently. An example, during World War One, I was able to make many observations on this specificity of techniques. For instance, the technique of digging. The English troops I was with did not know how to use French spades, which forced us to change 8,000 spades a division when we relieved a French division, and vice versa. This plainly shows that a manual knack can only be learned slowly. Every technique, properly so called, has its own form. And this idea of being specialized in different ways of digging could also be expanded to understand of different ways of thinking and different ways of using tools. In this example, using shovels as tools for digging, but we can also use this as to understand how we use methods and techniques as tools to produce knowledge, right? And learning a different way of doing things is slow. Segment. Thank you and see you later.